Hello again, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our member program, our Object Spotlight series, where we go behind the scenes for a closer look at objects from our renowned permanent collection. I'm Jory Sheriff, Associate Director of Membership. And I know I say this before every program, but I really do mean it. Thank you so much for your membership support and for all the ways you stay connected to the museum. We're incredibly grateful. Today's program is an exclusive first look at several remarkable objects from our collection that will be highlighted in our upcoming monumental exhibition called The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, which opens for a member preview on June 30th. And as you may know, the exhibition uses objects, artifacts, testimonies, photos, and film to reveal not only what happens when hate and bigotry go unchecked, but also the breadth of experiences that shaped families for generations. And here today to give us a closer look at the unforgettable stories behind these objects is Rebecca Frank, the museum's Curatorial Research Assistant. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jory.
Thank you so much for giving us a sneak peek at these objects, many of which will be on view for the first time in the exhibition. So Rebecca, before we get started, can you tell us a bit more about the part that you played in helping to bring this extraordinary exhibition to life?
Totally. Thank you so much, Jory, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We are so excited to be sharing with you this first look at objects from the upcoming new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do. I am a member of the museum's curatorial team and was really excited to get to work on this exhibition, doing research into the objects and figuring out how we are going to tell this history through these personal stories and be able to really share as much with you as possible. So in the exhibition, there are going to be over 750 objects and testimonies. So obviously, the objects that I will be sharing with you today is really just a very small preview and a small segment of the objects that will be in the exhibition. And also, when you come to the exhibition, you'll get to see them all in real life within the context of the entire exhibition, which will be really exciting. Also, for us, the personal stories are really, really important. And within a room where we're talking about the history of one event, we will also be sharing the personal stories of people that owned the object, that had stories tied to the object, that extends beyond the historical event just discussed within that room, but that enable to really share that fuller story. Because I think for so many of us, when we're able to connect on a personal level to the people who these objects belong to and to the people whose stories that we're telling, we're able to learn more about the history of the Holocaust and to connect to that history on a deeper level. And for visitors of so many different backgrounds, they're able to really, truly learn more extensively, both about that history, about those people, and about themselves and about their experiences relating to that story. And many of these objects today, all of them have remarkable stories. Many of them will be highlighted in that way within the exhibition with those additional personal story highlights. We won't be touching on exactly every single, obviously not every object, but also not necessarily on every single historical event or theme that will be touched on in the exhibition. But the objects today will really be giving a nice preview and overview of some of the stories that we will be able to tell in those historical events. So without further ado, I'd love to get started with our first objects. These first two objects on the screen are two examples of Prewar Judaica. They are both going to be within a room on Jews and Judaism, where over 20 different countries are going to be represented with ritual objects and pieces of Judaica. And really highlighting that vibrancy and diversity of pre-war Jewish life. And so you can see from the two that we chose to share with you today, that the pair on the left is from Aleppo, Syria, and on the right is an example of Judaica from Germany. And so just from looking at those two, you can really see that diversity of all the different countries and people that we will be representing within this room and showing this community that this diaspora and this Jewish community spread out throughout the world that so many sought to destroy. And so on the left are these beautiful mikvah clogs with inlaid mother of pearl. They belong to Rachel Rabbit Sutton, and they were gifted to her from her husband, Moshe Mansoura, in 1898. And they used to have straps on them. And mikvah clogs are worn by women before entering the mikvah, which is a ritual bath before one's wedding. And so they were gifted to her in 1898. And these clogs were passed down by Rachel from generation to generation as the family traveled, first to London and then eventually to New York. And in New York, Rachel lived in Brooklyn, and her family has shared many stories about her with us. And she used to crochet, was an excellent cook, loved going to the movies by herself in New York. And she died in 1957 in the Sephardic Home for the Aged in Brooklyn. And for Rachel, it's also a great opportunity for us to show you that so many of the objects that are in this exhibition and that I'll be speaking about today have New York connections. Obviously, a large part of that is because we are a New York Holocaust museum, but for our visitors, it'll be really special for them to see then the lives that so many survivors built in New York and connect that to our larger Jewish community. On the right is this beautiful silver etrog box, which is used for Sukkot. And it belonged to the Bear family, and they had it hidden with them during the Holocaust. This etrog box is an example of something that has never been on view. In our collection, we have about 40,000 objects and testimonies. So obviously, many of them have never been on view before. And as we were creating this new core exhibition on the Holocaust, it was really important to the curatorial team and to the museum as a whole for us to be able to share stories and objects that had been part of our collection, but that had not yet been on view, and that people would be able to learn about for the very first time. And especially for visitors that might know a lot about the Holocaust and are more familiar with the history, they don't know yet these objects and these personal stories. And so for them to be able to continue to learn more about them and to see these objects on view for the very first time is really exciting to us, because from our collection, we show these different objects. We use them for a number of different reasons in terms of with programs or for research and in a variety of ways beyond just exhibitions, but it is exciting 100% to be able to show our collection and to highlight it in different ways in different exhibitions. And in this one, you'll see this for the very first time. After we teach visitors about the history of Jews and Judaism, we will also be explaining to visitors the history of historical anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And in this room where we talk about historical anti-Judaism, one of the main takeaways that we want visitors to leave with is that anti-Semitism and persecution against Jews existed long before the Holocaust, long before the Nazis, in places other than Germany. And the letter on the left is a really stellar example of this. This letter was signed by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella on December 10th, 1492. And in March of 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had issued the Alhambra Decree, which had ordered that practicing Jews from Spain leave immediately. And by the end of the year, 175,000 Jews had left Spain and traveled to various different parts. Many actually went to Amsterdam and were crypto Jews, where they were practicing Jews in hiding. For this letter, after many of the Jews left, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had to figure out what to do with Jewish property and to any Jews that were remaining. And so you can see here at the bottom, and I think you should be able to see my mouse, is where their signatures are. And they had sent this letter to Rodrigo de Mercado, who was the leader of a commercial center, Medina del Campo, and had issued instructions to him about what to do with the Jews' property that was there. And to look at this letter, and I've seen it in person a number of times, and in the exhibition you'll be able to see something that old is really, really remarkable. From 1492, signed by the king and queen. It's actually, considering how old it is in remarkable condition, which really speaks to the royalty and to the fact that they had the highest of quality of paper. And really for visitors, it speaks so much to the fact that anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism existed long before the Holocaust, not in Germany, all the way in Spain, and will really be an opportunity to show that to these visitors. On the right of the object of the right is this 1551 proclamation. And in this proclamation, it was ordered in Germany that Jews were to wear this yellow badge in a circle, which you can see my mouse is moving around, to distinguish themselves from society. And hundreds of years later, on January 12, 1940, Reinhard Heydrich and the security police had gifted it to Hermann Göring. As many of you know, Heydrich and Göring were both key Nazi leaders and architects of the final solution. And the fact that Heydrich and the security police had decided to give Göring this birthday gift is really telling of the influence that historical anti-Judaism had on the Nazis and their policies. And right here, this text, it translates to, quote, "The attached document shows that vital questions of the German people, which Kaisers and kings tried to solve in the course of centuries, have found a solution in only a few years through the Führer Adolf Hitler and his associates." And it's really telling that they decided to give this as a birthday gift. And when you even just look at this 1551 proclamation on its own, it is such an example of that influence and of the fact that Jews were ordered to wear this yellow badge in Germany in the 1500s. And when you think about yellow stars that Jews were forced to wear during the Holocaust, you can really trace that line and see that inspiration that the Nazis had taken from their predecessors, and of the fact that anti-Judaism had existed long before the Holocaust. Of course, we will be touching on the complete timeline of historical anti-Semitism leading up to the rise of the Nazi Party within this room, but these are two examples of that historical, more older anti-Semitism. So when we turn to our room where we speak about the Nazis and the rise of Nazism, one really, really remarkable object is Heinrich Himmler's personal annotated copy of Mein Kampf. In our collection, we have both Volume 1 and Volume 2, which he had annotated. Most of his annotations were between 1926 and 1927. I'll explain that 1932 date in the caption in a moment. And the reason that we know exactly when he had read it is because something that Himmler did was at the end of every chapter, he wrote the exact date and location of where he was when he finished the chapter. And because of that, we can also tell he read it very slowly and would make many marks in the margins. So you can see here on the left some different notes that he had made, some underlinings, things that he had crossed out. Among some of his more noteworthy annotations that he had made was he had underlined a sentence where Hitler had written that if Germany had gassed 12,000 to 15,000 Jews in World War I, then the Germans could have saved thousands of German lives. And Himmler underlines that passage. And so, considering that Heinrich Himmler became a key architect of the Holocaust and of the final solution, being able to look at this document that was really before Himmler was Himmler and before he had become such a Nazi leader, before the death of Jews in the Holocaust had occurred, it's really an opportunity for scholars and visitors alike to study the mindset of Himmler and to be able to ask questions about why Himmler and Hitler and other Nazis decided to perpetrate the Holocaust and how one came to those types of decisions. And you're able to see it within his personal annotations. Years later, Himmler's father, Gebhard, read the same volumes of Himmler's Mein Kampf. And so he had read those exact same copies that his son had read, and he also made annotations throughout. And it's actually even though they both annotated it, their handwriting's actually very distinct from one another. So you're really able to tell what Himmler Sr. versus Himmler Jr. had annotated. And when he was finished at the very end, and that's this note right here, Himmler's father, Gebhard, he had written, read to the end with fervent interest and sincere admiration of this man, 2 June 1932. And in so many ways, Himmler's father saying that was both giving his overall admiration and approval of Hitler and of Mein Kampf and the words that were written and spoken in this manifesto, but also he was giving his blessing to his son to really become Himmler and to lead the Nazi Party. And within this room, we'll talk, of course, also about all of the different ways that the Nazis, came to power, and then also propaganda and ways that it affected everyday German life, and then also about the persecution of Jews. And it will lead up until 1939 with the start of World War II. Once we turn to World War II, we'll be talking about a number of, obviously the key battles, but then also within World War II, the initial effects for Jews in different ways and how Jews reacted in different ways to that initial wartime. One of the ways that Jews, after the start of World War II and after the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939, is many Polish Jews fled to the Soviet Union. And this story is actually especially personal for me because this is my family story and my ancestors, and these objects are in the museum's collection. And you can see here on the left is this pre-war portrait of the Jaskowitz family in Nowy Dwór, Poland, which was a suburb of Warsaw. And both when you're looking at this object and throughout the exhibition, we tried really as much as possible to be able to show the people whose objects they belong to and to show who they belong to and what the stories of those people were, and to show that hand in hand. And right here, this woman, her name was Jocheve Jaskowitz, and she was my great-grandmother. And after the invasion of Poland, she decided to flee Poland. None of the rest of her family came, and everyone except for Harry, her younger brother, who had also fled but separately died in the Holocaust. And as she was fleeing to the Soviet Union, which was part of this larger phenomenon of Polish Jews' flight to the Soviet Union, she met my great-grandfather Solomon, and they kept on heading east, and they eventually reached Tajikistan. They had gotten separated, and Solomon went on to fight with various groups throughout World War II, including with the Anders Army. But living in Tajikistan, she gave birth to my grandmother, Riva Spitz-Frank, and this here is her birth certificate from Riga, Tajikistan, from August 6, 1942, during the war in the Soviet Union, and as a Polish Jew that had fled there. And then really soon after, Riva was placed into an orphanage, and she stayed there, and her mother would come and visit her as much as she was able to. Often on Shabbat, she would come and bring her chocolate, and they both survived the Holocaust by being there in the Soviet Union and were able to reunite with Solomon after the war, and eventually move to Israel, and eventually move to the United States. The rest of their family pictured in this photograph died in the Holocaust in various places. And this story is part of this larger phenomenon of Polish Jews fleeing to the Soviet Union. And when we're talking about World War II, it's just one example of different responses that Jews took and of ways that World War II wartime affected Jews. We're also going to be within this room having a display of yellow stars, which Jews started to wear and were required to wear. And on that display, there will be 36 different yellow stars. They're from a number of different countries, and they will be displayed showing both the variations of the yellow star for different Jews. And there will be a number of personal stories and people's photographs attached to them as well. Moving forward we'll be speaking about the room on the ghettos. And this little girl on the left is Joanne Barber. And this is her in a resort town in Lithuania. And her family had grown up in Vilna, which was considered the Jerusalem of Lithuania, had a vibrant pre-war Jewish community. Yocheved and her parents, Rabbi Kalman Farber and Tzipora Farber, were an Orthodox family. And in 1941, when they were forced to move into the Vilna ghetto, it was of the utmost importance to her family, and especially to her father, that they continued to keep kosher and that they continued to maintain their Judaism and in every way that they possibly could. And something that her father, who had given a testimony to the museum, spoke about a lot was that for them, there was no point in surviving if they weren't able to survive as practicing Jews. And he took a number of different measures in order to be able to do so, including procuring work documents that permitted him to leave the ghetto. And when he would leave the ghetto, he would wear this special smuggling bag that he had specially sewn to fit the inside of his trousers. And I should say that smuggling bag will also be on view in the exhibition. And when he would wear the bag, he would then go out and risk his life to bring back kosher food and some other food, but mostly kosher food for his family to be able to eat in the ghetto. And he was caught and beaten multiple times, but he was able to survive. And something that he and his fellow smugglers, many of whom were also religious Jews, used to say to each other was, as long as your head is in one piece, you keep on going out the next day. And so that Rabbi Farber did, and he kept on going out and smuggling food for his family. He would cook the food in a special kosher pot that will also be on view within this room. And it now has a note on it about Yocheved, about them cooking the kosher food for Yocheved as a little girl when she was in the ghetto. You can see here this tefillin bag, which I'll get to in a moment. Yocheved brought this Torah scroll with her into the ghetto, and it's really reminiscent of Simchat Torah scrolls that so many children played with. And this photo doesn't fully do it justice. It's really only about this big. It's a toy Sefer Torah. And I think for so many of our visitors, they'll be able to connect to these miniature Torah scrolls that, at least for me, I remember playing with growing up, and seeing it is so reminiscent of our lives. And then to be able, our visitors, to then connect it to this story and to imagine a little girl playing with it in the Vilna ghetto is really special and something to think about. Eventually, her family was transported to the HKP labor camp, which was also in Vilna. And on March 27th, 1944, Yocheved was rounded up as part of a kinder action, or children's roundup, and she was brought to a nearby site and murdered. Her father found out that day, and in his diary that he was keeping from the camp, he wrote, quote, "On this day, the children of Israel were taken from HKP camp, among them our Yocheved. There are holy things we simply do not understand until a time in the future when God, blessed be he, might explain them to us." And shortly after, Rabbi Kalman Farber and his wife Tzipora were able to escape the HKP camp, and they went into hiding in a bunker in Vilna. And after liberation, and during that time when they were in hiding, Rabbi Farber had gone to the nearby site of Ponar, which was a wooded area where many Jews were murdered by members of the Einsatzgruppe mobile killing units and then Lithuanian collaborators into pits as part of the genocide by mass shooting, or killing fields are often known as the Holocaust by bullets. And we'll have an entire room where we talk about the killing fields and about that genocide by mass shooting that occurred in the final solution in German-conquered Soviet Union. And one time, Rabbi Farber had gone to Ponar, and he had been sorting through some of the belongings of Jews that were murdered there, which many Jews from Vilna had gone into Ponar and done that. And when he was sorting through those belongings, he came across this tefillin bag, another tefillin bag, and a prayer shawl, all of which he decided to keep and take back with him into hiding. And you can see here the initials SB. Rabbi Farber didn't know the man or woman who this tefillin bag had belonged to. He didn't know their story, but he decided to keep it with him. And I think the fact that he took this tefillin bag and then kept it and these other two pieces of Judaica, along with his daughter's Sefer Torah, is something that really speaks to him and to his spiritual resistance, and the fact that maintaining his Judaism was of that utmost importance to him, because he didn't know whose tefillin bag it was, and it's now left to stand in for really showing that enormity of Jews that were killed at Ponar and is part of the genocide by mass shooting. And he kept both the tefillin bag, the talit, and his daughter's Judaica, and brought it with him when he immigrated to Israel and continued practicing as a rabbi. Once we turn to death camps and concentration camps, well, many of the stories will also be about spiritual resistance and general life in the camps. And I think part of why we really wanted to be able to tell these stories of spiritual resistance is to show visitors that while persecution was ongoing, Jews did things against the odds and continued to resist in various ways, both in terms of physical resistance, which we'll have a whole section where we talk about physical resistance and partisans and brigades, but also by maintaining who they were and continuing to practice their religion in secret, in hiding, really risking their lives in order to do so. Right here on the left are a pair of tefillin that had belonged to Chaim Prewar. They were gifted to him by his rabbi at his bar mitzvah. And his rabbi had told him, take these tefillin with you everywhere you go. And Chaim Prewar really followed his rabbi's instructions. He brought them everywhere with him. Sometimes he would hide them in his underwear in order to continue to have these tefillin with him. And when he was deported to Sobibor in 1943, he again brought the tefillin with him. And this time, in order to keep them, but in order to keep himself safe, he buried them in a tin box and dug into the ground a hole and buried them right near his barrack. And right before the Sobibor uprising, Chaim dug the tefillin up and took them with him into the woods. And he was able to escape. He was able to keep his tefillin. And the fact that he was able to do so is really extraordinary, because so many Jews that fought in the Sobibor uprising and that had escaped Sobibor were caught and eventually murdered. And Chaim not only was able to survive, but he was also able to keep these tefillin, which if he had been caught with them, he would have been murdered. And something that he spoke about apparently over and over again after the Holocaust was that he believes he survived because he had the tefillin, and that having them with him is what kept him alive. And it's a really special story. In the center is this Haggadah, and especially because Passover is this week, I thought it would be extra special to talk about this. And this was a Haggadah that was handwritten from memory by Dina Kraus in the Unterlust labor camp. And before the war, Dina was a Hebrew school teacher, and a group of girls in her barrack knew that she was a Hebrew school teacher, and they approached her and asked her to create this secret Seder and to conduct services with them in secret. And so Dina prepared, and she made this Haggadah with pencil, handwritten from memory. And it is so extensive. And the fact that she was able to do that and to remember so much of the Haggadah, which sets the order of the Seder and tells the story of the Jews' exodus, is just really special. And that she was able to do so is extraordinary. And one of the phrases that she wrote within it was, quote, "This year we are slaves, but next year we will be free." And of course, those are words that so many of us recognize from Passover, but it was especially meaningful, I'm sure, for Dina Kraus when she said them for this secret Seder in the Unterlust labor camp. And a year later, she was free, and she was able to celebrate Passover as a free woman. And it's really incredible that she was able to do that. Right here on the right is this beautiful enamel bowl which had belonged to the Berbia family, which were from Tripoli, Libya. They were a traditional Sephardic family. And because of their British citizenship, many and their descendants originally being from Great Britain, the Borbias were deported first to the Ghiado concentration camp, also in Libya, and then eventually to Italy, and then eventually to Bergen-Belsen. And they brought this bull with them from Libya. When they were deported all these places, they would use it to eat their food and for washing and for a variety of different ways that one uses a bull. And in Bergen-Belsen, their youngest son was born, and they had his bris or circumcision. They carried him to the circumcision by the Libyan Mohel in Bergen-Belsen in this bull. And so they were able to circumcise him within this bull and to use that bull for that ritual ceremony within Bergen-Belsen. And after the war, the family moved to Israel. And one of my colleagues, who's a curator on the exhibition, Judy Baumel-Schwartz, she had been interviewing the Berbia family many years ago in Israel, and Mrs. Berbia brought this bull with her. And she told the story of the bull. They spoke about her experience in Bergen-Belsen and having been deported from Libya to multiple camps and surviving the Holocaust, and then eventually moving to Israel. And afterwards, all of us, she left, and all of a sudden Judy looked up and realized that the bull was still there. And she ran after Mrs. Berbia and asked her, "Your bull, you left your bull." And Mrs. Berbia said, "No, I've told my story. The bull served its purpose for me. You take it, you use it to share my story." And Judy kept the bull and she lectured with it for many years, and then eventually decided to donate it to the Museum of Jewish Heritage so that we too could continue to tell the story of the Berbias and of Jews that were deported from Libya, and of experiences of Jews, both their everyday life and of spiritual resistance within concentration camps. And all three of these are just three stories of Jews who were able to survive the Holocaust and who lived through these death and concentration camps and resisted in their own way. Later on in the exhibition, we will be telling a number of different stories related to what the world knew and did during the Holocaust. And one of these is related to Max Lerner, who I believe is with us today. And Max Lerner and his family, after the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria, they decided to flee Austria because of the conditions. And they had to stop in a number of different places, including France and Portugal. And while the objects that you're seeing here on screen today are related to Max's time later in the war, which I'll get to in a second, Max's story is an example of someone who we'll be following throughout the exhibition and whose objects are in multiple different rooms of the exhibition because it speaks to those different themes within them and that we're able to follow throughout. And so early on in the exhibition, when we talk about emigration and Jews who fled in 1939, 1940, his story will be told there. And we have a number of different documents, including his ship ticket and his passport that the family had used when they were emigrating. So they eventually arrived to New York in April of 1941. And just over a year later, exactly on his 18th birthday, Max enlisted in the US Army, and he was desperate to aid the war effort and spoke extensively about how he knew that he really needed to do so. And because of his fluency in 3 different languages, Max was selected to be sent to Camp Ritchie in Maryland, where he became what's often known as the Ritchie Boys. And many of the other men in the army that were at Camp Ritchie were also refugees from Germany and Austria. And because of their language skills, they were training in intelligence to go undercover and to collect information as Germans, and because they were all native Germans and Austrians and spoke German as a native language. And so in March of 1944, Lerner returned to Europe, this time as an American citizen, which he had become in Camp Ritchie. He had become a citizen. And when he got there, you can see here his US Army uniform, and then on the bottom is a Nazi uniform, which he had actually used undercover as part of his intelligence missions. And he was part of the Office of Strategic Services and the Counterintelligence Corps. He would gather intelligence, sneak behind enemy lines, disguised as a German soldier. Right here in the center is this cigar box of various mementos of objects that Max had brought back with him from Germany. And these, you can see some of them right here as an Iron Cross. His dog tags are in here, different medals that he had won and that he had collected from Nazis. And it's really a box of different memories that he had had from his experiences. And right here, you can see these two dog tags that were his in the US Army, and they both have the H on them for Hebrew. And he's actually spoken about how it was a decision to have the H on the dog tag, but that he decided that if he was ever to be caught, he wanted them to truly know who he was, and that's why he had the H there for Hebrew on the dog tag. So this is Max right after he was discharged in early 1946. And after the war, he had also continued to collect intelligence and participate in the denazification effort. We'll be showing a number of different weapons, both that he had collected and that he had used, and of a Nazi cap that he had worn and that he had worn undercover. Within this room, we're also going to be talking about the War Refugee Board. Of course, these are two experiences of what the world knew and did, and both of these are related to Jews and their responses, but we will also be talking about both inaction and action efforts of the US government and of other allied efforts during the war. One of which was the War Refugee Board, which President Roosevelt had set up. And when we speak about the War Refugee Board, we'll talk about Fort Ontario, which was a refugee shelter that was set up in Oswego, New York, in upstate New York. And that in 1944, President Roosevelt and the War Refugee Board decided to invite 1,000 refugees to come to New York to live at Fort Ontario. And Doris Schechter, who I'll get to her story in one moment, is her and her family were chosen as part of that group. 982 Jews are who made the trip to the US. They sailed on the Heinrich Himmler, and they came to Fort Ontario and were sent to the camp there. And at this time in 1944 in the US, there were a lot of questions about refugees and about the war effort and if the US wanted to be bringing any refugees in. And the US then had a really complicated relationship with refugees. And in order for the War Refugee Board to be able to bring any refugees in, they had to say that they were only refugees that they, after the war, would have to leave, that they weren't citizens. And and there really wasn't too spoken about that this was happening and that any refugees were coming at all. So Doris Schechter, she was born in Austria, and also similar to Max, after the Anschluss, her family decided to leave. And they had first gone to Italy, and she was only 6 months old when they had gone to Italy. And there in Italy, Doris and her mother and father and her sister were in a camp for a period of time, and her father had worked with the Office of War Information. And because of his work with the Office of War Information, had gotten word of this opportunity to be able to come to the United States. And Doris, from what she remembers, had a really lovely experience when she was in Italy, and she remembers being treated really well by other Italians. And for her father, coming to America spoke of so much opportunity, and he knew America as the land of the free and a place where he really truly believed that his family, if given the opportunity, would be able to come and have an amazing life. And so in 1944, they sailed on the Heinrich Himmler and came to the United States and were sent to Fort Ontario. And Doris speaks a lot about her experiences with Fort Ontario, and she's also with us today, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know her really well. And when she speaks about it, she speaks a lot at first about how she had a lot of negative experiences when she was in the camp. And the first and foremost one was that her father died in October of 1945 when they were in the camp. But prior to, she also tells a lot of stories about they had built a sukkah in the camp that had blown away from the wind. This Passover Haggadah they had used in Fort Ontario in 1945 because they were there from the fall of 1944 until January of 1946. And as refugees there, her father wrote many letters in and out of the camp, and he received many from friends in New York. And so you can see here this letter that one of his friends had written him talking about Oswego, New York, and about his experiences there. This here on the left is Doris's mother, Berta Blumenkranz's ID card from the camp. This was the Haggadah that they had used, one of 4 when they were there. And one of the things that her father had done when he was in Fort Ontario was he wrote a memoir about his experiences. The Reader's Digest had asked many of the refugees that were there to write these memoirs about their experiences and about their life. And Doris says that discovering her father's memoir is one of the greatest gifts of her life because she was able to learn so much more about her father and about her experience from reading his memoir many years later and continuing to read it. Her father did have a lot of complicated opinions about their time in Fort Ontario, and he had had such high expectations for their life there. And then from the restricted camp, one of the things that he had written to one of his friends in a letter was, quote, "Who could know in advance that we would be deprived of our freedom in the country of the free?" So obviously it was a complicated relationship and complicated that refugees were forced to stay there. In January of 1946, you could see this letter that was sent from the US Department of the Interior to Doris, at that time, Dorit Blumenkranz, granting them citizenship, as after the war, it was decided that all of the Jews that were in Fort Ontario and in the refugee shelter there in Oswego, New York, would be allowed to become citizens. And Doris went on to be a very successful woman in New York City and creating My Most Favorite Dessert Company. And she's spoken about one of the second greatest gifts that was given to her, besides her father's memoir, was her friendship with Ruth Gruber, who had, because of her role with the Department of the Interior, she had accompanied the Jews on the Henry Gibbons to the United States. And Doris reconnected with her after and was able to really talk through so many of her experiences as a refugee in Fort Ontario. And then throughout her life, Doris speaks about how Ruth had become a surrogate mother to her. And something that then, both in speaking with Ruth and in reading her father's memoir, Doris was able to think differently too about her experiences in Fort Ontario and the fact that coming here, this was how she was able to survive, and how lucky she truly was to be one of the 982 Jews that were brought here to New York and survived the remainder of the war in Oswego. In our final room in the exhibition, we're going to be speaking about liberation, immediate aftermath, various different ways of rebuilding, and of the different nuances of that immediate post-war period, of the fact that life wasn't so simple right after, that Jews were searching for family, were often not discovering that their family had died, were trying to rebuild in various deportation camps and throughout the world. And one of the stories that we'll be talking about is commemoration and mourning, and the way that Jews took different steps in that immediate post-war period to commemorate what had happened. And this one actually it's post-liberation, but it's from during the wartime. And it's this beautiful Megillah that was created by Prosper Hassin. It's called the Hitler Megillah, which I'll explain why in one moment. And it was to commemorate the liberation of Casablanca in Morocco from Vichy rule in November of 1942. And so after liberation, Prosper created this Megillah, which tells the history of, and a Megillah is an Esther scroll that is used in Purim, to tell the story of Esther and Mordecai and the Jews in Persia and the biblical story. And Hassin decided to use much of the form and much of the language of a typical Esther scroll, and instead use it to tell the story of Hitler's rise to power, Nazis, World War II, the persecution of Jews. And it's really interesting to look at and to see the way that he uses that same language and uses that story of a genocide against Jews in Persia and of Esther and Mordecai being able to take over King Ahasuerus and to, or not take over King Ahasuerus, to take over Haman and to work with King Ahasuerus in order to save the Jews in Persia. And he uses it to tell this different story. And you can see here in this detail from it that instead of the part of the Hitler Megillah that's cursed be Haman, it says cursed be Hitler. So Arur Hitler, Arur Mussolini, Arur Goering, and different Axis leaders. So, and then here, instead of the part where it's blessed be Mordecai, blessed be Esther, blessed be Ahasuerus, it's blessed be Roosevelt, blessed be Churchill, blessed be Stalin, blessed be de Gaulle. So this is such a prime example where you can see that way that it follows that same form of a typical Esther scroll, of a typical Megillah, and uses it to tell this particular story. And they used it in Casablanca for special Purims in 1943, 1944, and 1945. And it's one example of the ways that Jews were able to both commemorate, but then also to tell the history and share the story of what had happened during the Holocaust, in this case to their community, both in Casablanca and throughout the world. And with that, I would love to turn it back to Jory and open it up to questions that you may have about these objects and about the exhibition.
First of all, thank you so much, Becky. It's incredible to hear about these stories from your perspective because you worked so closely with these incredible objects and testimonies and artifacts. And I just want to reiterate that this exhibition is just incredibly important, both in terms of its scope and the way in which it reveals the true global impact of the Holocaust. And I think we have a couple of questions just about if you could talk more about the curatorial team's process of selecting these objects and artifacts, because our collection is so remarkable. It's, as you said, over 40,000 pieces. And so I would just love to hear from your perspective how the team went about curating these pieces.
Yeah, I think once deciding what our narrative was going to be in the exhibition and what aspects of the history of the Holocaust and of the Jews prior to the Holocaust that we wanted to tell, it was a matter of figuring out what objects really told that story, and that then we were able to, that really exemplified the different experiences that Jews had, but then also of personal experiences tied to them. And it was really important to us to show as many objects that had never been on view ever, because as this is our new core exhibition, it is going to be really different from the old core exhibition that was at the museum and showing so many objects for the very first time. We are actively collecting at institution, and so many of the objects we acquired within the last year or two. And so that's really exciting. And really the strongest objects that we would be able to tell these stories and that we thought that visitors would really connect to.
Were there any objects or artifacts in the exhibition that really surprised you, that you were surprised to learn about?
I think that one of the objects there's a few objects in our collection that when I first started working here, was so surprised to hear that we had them and so excited that they were in our museum's collection. I think the letter that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella signed, it's remarkable that that exists and that we have that here in our museum's collection. I think Himmler's Mein Kampf, that he annotated that and that we have that here. Another example of something that we have that I think is really remarkable is Gerhard Riegner's personal copy of the telegram that he had sent in 1942. And he had decided to donate his personal copy to us, to the museum, and we're able to show that, to show the Riegner cable and what Jews, and we're telling the world about what was happening, and then what the US was learning, and they had originally rejected his cable to even be delivered from Geneva to Rabbi Stephen Wise. And I think the fact that we have his personal copy is really, really cool, and it'll be exciting for people to be able to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people have questions about the process of, we are a collecting institution. We actively acquire works. Can you tell us more about that process and how we go about that?
Yes, so if people are interested in donating objects to the museum's collection, if you could first please email collections@mjhnyc.org, which we can put that in the chat. But if you're interested in donating your family's objects or objects that have come into your possession, you can contact us there, and then we go through a process where we work with the family and with the individual to see what they have, and then learn everything that we can about their family's background and their story. And then we compare it to what we have within our collection and the ways that it can enhance our collection. And we have a committee that goes over every single acquisition and figures out if it has a place in our collection. And then we continue to work with the family and figure it all out. And then it can be able to join our museum's collection. And personally, as an object donor myself, and as someone that's on the new acquisitions committee, it's so special to be able to donate objects to the museum, to know that they can be put on view in an exhibition in 2022, and then in one context to one set of objects in one narrative, and then in 2050 or 2100 or 500 years, they can be shown with other objects and in a new context with new scholarship, with new visitors, and with new museum staff. And I think knowing that your family's objects are able to be preserved by a museum and live on in a museum's collection for forever is truly an honor, and truly something that I hope many people are interested in doing and are able to share their family's stories in that way.
Do you have a favorite? You talked before about the fact that there will be several, this is a multi-level exhibition and there are several rooms within the exhibition. Do you have a favorite room, or a room that you were just, that you just really appreciated being a part
of? I'm hesitant to say that I have a favorite. However, I really love our room that we have early on in the exhibition on Jews and Judaism. And I think that when visitors are there, they will be able to really connect to pre-war Jewish life and to see that vibrancy and diversity. I know I said it within the presentation, but there'll be over 20 different countries represented in just that room. And I think for visitors to be able to see, pieces of Judaica and of Jewish cultural life, and the way that Jews were able to had similar practices in different parts of the world at this time is so special. And it's really a room of celebration. The colors are really vibrant. I think that visitors within it are just going to be so excited to be inside of it and to see all of these different objects.
I agree. I'm just mining the chat to see if we have any other questions. We have one more. We have time for one more. This is, again, people are very interested in our collection, which is lovely. One member asked, how are objects authenticated? And I'm not sure if you are able to speak about that, but that was one of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, so we go through a number of different processes, really depending on the object, and we have, our own collecting policies, and we'll work with various different scholars and people that focus on that particular part of history, and by comparing it with research and with other scholars, and then also with objects that are already within our own collection, we're able to, it's really a case-by-case basis, but we're really able to authenticate these objects.
That's wonderful. Well, I will leave off with this, I will just say, first of all, thank you so much. You did an incredible job, and this is a great first look at this remarkable exhibition, which will be on view to members for a member preview on June 30th. And so we will send more information about how to register for that. The galleries will be private for members, so you can experience this incredible exhibition without the lines or the crowds. And we're so excited for you to see it. So thank you again, Becca. We're so grateful. Thank you so much for the sneak peek.
Thank you so much. And you'll get to see all these objects in real life, which will be and so many more.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We're so grateful for your membership support. Have a great night, and we'll hope to see you soon. Take care.